Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear. Here we go.
But other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendlesham Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
Arrow is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
Welcome back to Disclosure Team with me, your host, Vinny Adams. The following is an interview with Dr. David Clarke. In this interview, we discuss the Broadhaven case from 1977. This case was recently featured in the Netflix documentary series Encounters. David featured prominently in the episode The Broadhaven Triangle. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. David Clarke. Welcome back, David.
Well, thanks for having me again.
No problem.
A regular guest.
You are. I think you're probably the most, returned guest out of them all. So, no, I appreciate it. But the reason why I wanted you back is because we obviously earlier on in October, we had the release of the Spielberg-produced Encounters on Netflix, the series covering, I think, 4 different sort of incidents. One being, when it was named, the Broadhaven Triangle. And now I've heard of the Broadhaven School case from 1977 and then the Welsh Triangle, and it seems that they're kind of pulling them together. Could you kind of explain the differences and what it's all about?
Yeah, well, for those of us who are 70s throwbacks like me, as it came over in that show, it was actually all the stories about the Welsh, the Broadhaven case that actually drew me into this subject in the first place. As a delicate 10-year-old who was massively into science fiction at the time and sort of Doctor Who and all the rest of it. And I distinctly remember seeing that program it started with, which was John Craven's News Round and those kids being interviewed. But to answer your question, where the triangle thing came from was simply because at the time, the Bermuda Triangle mystery was massive. There'd been a documentary about it on telly. The book by Charles Berlitz was like one of the sort of trashy 1970s paperbacks that I was reading, everyone else was reading. And I think you may have this as an image, Vinny, somewhere. The Sun, I think it was, used something like Terror Triangle in one of the stories that they wrote about the sightings in Wales. So it was like, whenever there was an outbreak, that's the one. And I remember... I was an avid Sun reader at the time as well. So I remember seeing that Spaceman mystery of the Terror Triangle. So they were sort of juxtaposing the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle into Wales.
Right.
Now, I mean, you've also got an image, haven't you? I think from the Netflix show that they constructed, showing where this so-called triangle was supposed to sit. And it was a thing that at that time, that because the triangle in Bermuda was also linked not only with disappearing planes and ships, but also reports of UFO sightings. If you read Charles Berlitz's book, he tries to link the two. And obviously there's the very seminal story of Flight 19, the flight of American aircraft, I can't remember from which base, that disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle in 1945.
Yes, absolutely. It was a squadron, wasn't it?
Squadron, yeah. And they were on a training flight, weren't they? And they got disorientated, ran out of fuel, and crashed into the sea. That's the official explanation. But it's one of the seminal cases. And if you've seen Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it actually starts with the discovery of what appears to be those planes from Flight 19. And of course, they've all been sucked up into a huge hovering spacecraft, the one that appears at the end of the film. And because the aliens have returned and they're making friendly contact, they're leaving all these planes and ships that they've kidnapped over the last century or so in obscure places. So there was this link in the popular imagination with Flight 19, UFOs, Bermuda Triangle. So when we got this outbreak of sightings in Wales in the mid-1970s, it was quite natural for people to start saying, all right, well, there was a sighting at Broadhaven, there was a sighting here. Ooh, that forms a triangle.
I suppose you can make it fit anywhere, really, can't you?
But it wasn't the first. I mean, people will remember Warminster. So the West Wales flap wasn't actually the first. We're used to this now, aren't we, in ufology? There's places like Bonnybridge, Rendlesham, but the very first place that was the place to go and see UFOs was Warminster in Wiltshire in the 1960s. And that kicked off about 1964, and it had gone out of favor by the early 1970s, and UFO enthusiasts, UFO researchers used to all gravitate there on bank holiday weekends, and there'd be hundreds of people out on the hillsides with telescopes and binoculars. And Arthur Shuttlewood, who was the local journalist who triggered the whole Warminster phenomenon off, he was like the guru. He used to sort of come out and wander around and say, right, hang around with me and we'll see a UFO tonight. What no one mentioned is that if you go to Warminster, it's right on the border of the Ministry of Defence British Army's main training ground, where they're always firing off flares and tanks are roaming around. So the novelty of Warminster had worn off by the early 1970s, and I think people were looking for another location, another sort of UFO hotspot, so to speak, and West Wales seemed to be the place. And there was this chap called Randall Jones Pugh, lovely Welsh name, who was mentioned in the Netflix documentary, sadly dead now, but he was the local investigator for BUFORA, the British UFO Research Association, which still exists, and he almost functioned a bit like Arthur Shuttlewood did in Warminster, in that although he wasn't a journalist, he was a retired vet. Everybody knew him in that community, that farming community, because he was the guy who, whenever you got a sick cow, Randall Jones Pugh came round, and if you'd seen a UFO, you could tell him about your UFO sighting as well. And he would pass it on to Hugh Turnbull, who was the local journalist at the Western Telegraph, which was a local paper based in Haverfordwest. And if you go to Haverfordwest Library, they've got an amazing archive. That's a huge box file full of cuttings about the 1970s. And if you look through that, because I used to go there on family holidays quite regularly, and if you look at how this all started, Randall Jones Pugh was constantly in the local paper during 1976, and he actually predicted that it looks like we're going to have a big wave of sightings. And it's almost like what he predicted then came true in 1977, which was when all this started happening early in the year.
Wow, that's crazy. And so we're talking about all these different things that occurred in that triangle, but so where did it start?
Well, I think it started with the Broadhaven primary school sighting, and it's interesting that, I mean, the research I've done, and never gets mentioned the significance of it. Bizarrely, there was this period of time in 1976, 1977 when there was sighting after sighting after sighting by school kids in playgrounds. Now we're in this era now where all we're interested in is, you know, high-ranking military pilots seeing things and credible witnesses and things. But kids also see things. Young people, children. You know, they might not be as credible as pilots, but in these cases, these were like mass sightings. And then the second episode of Encounters was the aerial school case, wasn't it, from Africa? So Steven Spielberg's obviously interested in these cases involving children. So although the Broadhaven case is the one that got mass publicity, it was on TV 2 or 3 times, there were several others both before and after Broadhaven, including one in Cheshire that's got a whole file at the National Archives, where you got a bunch of kids who were out at lunchtime or whatever it was, and they saw something odd in the sky. Now, the interesting thing with Broadhaven, which again was not mentioned in the program, was they never actually saw anything in the sky.
Just landed.
They didn't see it land. They'd had I think it was a Thursday morning. I think it was early in February. I think it was the 5th of February. And I mean, you know what February's like. Horrible day, drizzly, you know. And if you go to Broadhaven School, primary school, where I've been to actually see where this happened, it's almost like there's a school at the top of the hill and it sits in a hollow, and there's like all these sort of trees down at the bottom and a sewage plant, which might have significance. So I think they'd gone out at lunchtime, and this event unfolded over the course of the afternoon. It wasn't just like a small, they saw something for a few minutes. It was going on for quite a while, and it was like one of these sort of rumors that there was something odd that someone had seen, and then someone else saw it, and then a group of others went out and saw it, and they kept going back in and saying to the teachers, you know, there's this spaceship or something in the playground behind at the bottom of the playing field where the trees were. And of course, teachers just thought, this is, you know, 9-10-year-old kids. They'd been watching too much telly, which is something we'll return to. But basically, what they said they saw, and David Davies, who's the chief witness, who's exactly my age, he was 10 at the time, I was 10, tells the story very well, stuck by his story all through his life, definitely saw something. But what did he see? He didn't see something come out of the sky and land. There he is.
There he is,
in 1977, and there he is now.
Yeah.
Still lives in the area. And what did he see? He saw something as a result of what he'd been told by his mates. And you can imagine, you know what kids are like in playground, and rumors go around and people are teasing each other and fighting and all the rest of it, teasing each other. They'd seen like a silvery cigar-shaped object that was sort of hovering or moving out of this foliage and then moving back into it. And several of I don't think David Davies said he saw any sort of creature connected to it, but several of them claimed that they'd seen a silvery man standing next to it as well. And this went on for a while. In the end, they all sort of, because no one would take them seriously, they all went and protested outside the head teacher's office, a guy called Ralph Llewellyn. And I don't think he took them seriously initially, but I think they ended up at the police station telling the police about it in the end. So they clearly had some kind of eerie, unsettling experience. And what happened was then, the story obviously, they all went home, and on the Monday morning when they came back, they were starting to take it seriously then, the teachers, because they weren't, you know, they were sticking by the story and saying that they'd seen this thing. And that's the point at which he sat them all down and gave them paper and crayons and said, right, draw what you've seen. And that is an amazing picture, that one. That's from the Western Telegraph, I think.
Right.
Where they're all holding up. So they're all, I think they were mainly 9-10-year-olds. I think there was one girl as well. And it's the girl's drawing that's actually in the National Archives file. I don't know what ended up, where the others ended up.
Would that be just, sorry, so I've got 2 in the National Archives file.
Yeah.
So I've got this one,
That's the one. Yeah,
It's
that's
on
the
there.
one drawn by the sole girl witness, 10-year-old girl that was there.
I noticed they got a redaction there. I bet that's her name, isn't it?
It will
Because
be.
they like doing that, don't they?
Age 9.5. This is what kids love to say, isn't it? I was 9 3/4 at the time.
Oh, brilliant.
So that's in one of the National Archives files, and I think the school retained have got all the original drawings in a big scrapbook. Although I heard that they'd given it away to some, I think John Anson, I think it was. I think he may have the originals, but they've certainly got copies.
Is that it
That's
there?
it. That's it. Yeah, and there's an entry by the head. That's the school diary next to the scrapbook. I mean, this is UFO history, folks. You know, this is an amazing thing that's kept in the school to this day. And that's the diary written by Ralph Llewellyn, and he says in there that he was reluctant to believe them at the time, but then when he spoke to them all, got them to do the drawings, he became convinced that something had happened and they had a genuine experience that had terrified them, which it had. But he says something in his little handwritten entry that he thinks there's some kind of natural explanation for it. I mean, there's a lot being said about that they are remarkably similar. I think if we go back to the bit where they're holding up the pictures, I'm not convinced they are remarkably similar, to be honest.
True, there are. I suppose I can see a couple of similarities throughout, but generally they are very different. You've got cigars, you've got more sort of spherical, some with points on the top, some without. Yeah.
Now, the one on the furthest left is the one that interests me. That one, because what may have influenced them? Now, I'm not. What people often take this out of context, particularly on Twitter, when I go banging on about films and pop culture and television programs and that. What I am not saying is that these kids made it up because they'd seen something on telly. Right? Let's get that right. What I'm saying is, they had some kind of experience. No one's doubting that. We don't know what it was they saw. But like it or not, how they've drawn the thing that they saw has got remarkable similarities to something that was on television at the time, which was the 1956 film Forbidden Planet. Now, anyone who's seen that, it's all takes place on an alien planet. It's a classic sort of 1950s sci-fi thing with Robbie the Robot and all the rest of it. Now, if you're looking for Radio Times, the film was actually being shown. It was actually after the Broadhaven case, so you can't say they'd seen it immediately before, and that had influenced what they'd drawn. But what went on in the 1970s, and I remember this very well because no one had video recorders at the time.
Right.
They used to relentlessly trail films. So because Forbidden Planet and whatever other sci-fi film was being shown, they would be trailing it every Wednesday throughout the month, and they'd be showing clips from the film. And the iconic clip from Forbidden Planet, and you will have seen this on numerous UFO documentaries, is where the disc-shaped UFO comes to land on this planet and the undercarriage drops down, which looks like a ladder. So if we go back to that drawing, what that young lad has looks uncannily similar to the spaceship that lands on Altair 4 at the beginning of Forbidden Planet, which was being trailed. Now, call me a cynic, call me a skeptic, call me a debunker. There is, it's common sense that there's some influence there. So whether they'd seen it, they'd all been talking about sci-fi and spaceships and all the rest of it. And I'm not suggesting they made the whole thing up. They obviously saw something, and then when they sat down and drew it, all these things from popular culture, which is what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in whether there's real aliens there. I'm interested in what people's ideas of what these things look like influence what they say they've seen. And the interesting thing about this is they had the experience. I think it was either a Thursday or a Friday. Now, if you were doing this scientifically, the ed teacher would have got them all sat down and before they had the chance to talk to each other about what they'd seen, got them sat down then. The problem was they all went home for weekend, and of course they'd be all out looking about, wouldn't they, over at weekend, as 10-year-olds do. You're not telling me that none of that group saw each other at all over the weekend. They came back to school on Monday, he sat them down and got them to do the drawings, and you've seen the drawings. I reckon if he'd got them sat down straight away after the experience, you'd have had a different set of drawings. But we'll never know, will we?
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. I mean, I can see it from all perspectives. And like you said, because we don't know, I suppose it has to just remain an open case, I suppose. So.
And also the drawing of the alien that one of the other lads did. I don't know if it's very clear on that picture, but the alien's got two little protuberances sticking out of his head.
See it there,
Yeah. Now, if you look at a picture of Robbie the robot,
oh really?
Robbie the robot's got two.
Ah, okay.
Aerials or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. Interesting.
Either way, I think it's a great story. I think it, to me, a lot of UFO purists out there will say, "Oh, it's kids. They're not reliable witnesses. Let's concentrate on what these pilots are seeing, the US Navy pilots." But to me, that story is as interesting in terms of a UFO experience as what we've been hearing from the USA with the videos. They're all UFO experiences, different types of experiences, but how is what those kids say they saw any less interesting from a human point of view than somebody in the cockpit of one of these fancy US Navy jets?
No, I agree. And I think, in the last few years since the Ariel school case has been sort of thrown back into kind of the mainstream of ufology, I think a lot of people are now starting to think of kids as reliable witnesses, because why would kids lie? They're just pure and innocent. They don't lie. But, I can see it from both sides on that as well. And, and like you said, I was in the National Archives back in 2021 and came across a good couple of other school playground cases. Yeah. It's amazing. And you just don't really hear about them at all.
Yeah, the other one I was going to mention is from later the same year, October, I think it was, from the school in Cheshire. You probably saw those crayon drawings from that.
I saw one which I think was an all-girls school.
That might be that one, yeah. It's a Macclesfield school. I'd never heard about. It was never publicised. It just turned up in the archives when they released the files from ’77. Right. And that was a similar case where kids had been playing in the playground and they did actually see something come out of the sky, hover over some trees. And again, if you look at the drawings, they've got it's got a ladder coming down from it. Now, would alien spacecraft employ ladders?
I mean,
but again, the school took them seriously to the extent that they called the police. So there's a statement from the police. The police contacted Manchester Airport to check whether there'd been any unusual aerial activity. And they obviously took what these children said really seriously. It was sent through to the Ministry of Defence's UFO desk, who kept all the crayon drawings in the archives.
It's good to see, for sure. Mm. So, I mean, this is obviously, like we said, this is the first kind of incident that happened in that time period as far as the Welsh Triangle goes. So, I know a lot of the other ones weren't UFO cases necessarily. So, what sort was the next on the timeline?
Well, this takes us back to the beginning because for some reason it really caught the attention of the media, the national media. So then you got all the tabloids sending reporters to Wales to interview the kids, and the kids were interviewed live on John Craven's news round, which was what all 10-year-olds watch when they got back from school, including me.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was still running. Is it still running? I don't know.
I mean, I watched it in the it would have been early to mid 80s. So
it was good because he covered a lot of technology stuff. It wasn't frivolous. He did loads of sort of stuff about space technology, moon landings, all kinds of interesting things. If you were into that that sort of area as a kid, as we all were, and the other thing was then they all got invited onto Magpie, which was the big sort of kids music show that was sort of not Top of the Pops was for slightly older teenagers. Magpie was the more cool thing if you were like 10 or 11. Right. So they all appeared on there, and there was quite a good bit on that Encounter show where David Davis says that he had the black eye when he appeared on that show because he was being relentlessly bullied by other kids because of he was the one who was doing all the talking to the media, and I think there was a lot of jealousy of that he was so articulate and he he was a bit of a chubby kid at the time, and those kinds of kids tend to get picked on, and he was obviously relentlessly picked on, not just when he was at school, but after he left as well, as a result of this experience. And, bully to him, he's stuck with the story, even when there was Ray Gosling from the BBC did a radio program in the 90s, and he really focused in on David Davis, and he was convinced that David Davis had made it up, and he was going to get him to admit the whole thing was a joke live on his radio show, and he would not have it. If you can find that, Gosling in a Flap, it was the series, and the program he did on the Welsh Triangle is really, really good from a number of different point of view. But he was, I wouldn't call him a skeptic. He was someone who was determined to prove the whole thing was a joke. And the interesting thing about the show was he fails to do that at the end.
It's interesting.
So yeah, so obviously it got mass publicity. It was in all the tabloids. The Sun loved it. We've seen the story in the Sun, and then you got a torrent of, as you do with all these things, like with Rendlesham, like with Bonnie Bridge. Once people think there's something odd to see, and you can go and see it in a particular place, suddenly all these other people start seeing things. And to be fair, a lot of people came forward with stories about things they'd seen in the sky over West Wales years before.
Right.
And this sort of gave them the opportunity to talk about it. And I mean, I don't know how familiar people watching this are with that area of Wales. It's about as far west as you can get. I mean, for me, it's a good sort of 4-hour drive from Yorkshire. It's a national park, Pembroke National Park. It's really dramatic scenery. I mean, it's a bit like Cornwall, where you've got dramatic sort of beaches, and you've got, sort of there's a coastal path that sort of is a real killer. If you walk it, it's up and down and up and down. A lot of ancient sites, a lot of folklore and mythology, which is what they gave me a bit of space to talk about on that show. So what happened then was you got lots of other kids saying that they'd seen things, teenagers saying that they'd had weird sightings, and you got these two interesting stories. The one of which was the Rierson farm experiences, where you got this family, the Coombs, Billy Coombs, who was like a hired sort of herdsman. It wasn't his farm; he lived on at Rierson Farm. But he didn't own it, and the farm was sort of split in two, and there was a young couple living next door who never get mentioned.
Right.
That's another story. But him and his wife, Pauline, were the epicenter of a whole weird series of events. The sort of things that, Danny Robbins' Uncanny program that's been on BBC recently from the podcast, it's the sort of thing that Danny Robbins would absolutely love. They were having, I don't know whether they're having sort of poltergeist type things, but they were seeing things in the sky constantly. Pauline's car was pursued by this football-shaped glowing object. They were all sort of terrified by it. The engine cut out. And there was this bizarre thing where he got this herd of cows, 150 cows that he was looking after, that were there 1 minute and then gone the next, and turned up on some other farm, inexplicably, without the gate being open. The gate was blocked. It's like something that Charles Fort would have wrote about, like teleportations of animals, weird things like that going on. And then all this culminated in April 1977. One night, the kids had gone to bed, and Billy and Pauline were sat in the front room. I think they were watching a John Wayne Western film on telly. This is about, I don't know, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And they turned around, and the window, there was this figure standing out the window that was towering above the window, 7 or 8 foot tall, in a spacesuit, the sort of thing that NASA astronauts wore, glowing. And you can imagine the terror that they experienced. And one of the things I mentioned, that Ray Gosling program, the BBC program, they actually played a clip from that, which is where Ray Gosling tracks down the police officer who actually took the 999 call from the Coombs that night. And he said that, he went out there was nothing there when he got there, obviously, but that in his entire career in the police, they were the most terrified couple he'd ever spoken to, which does suggest that they weren't making this up, that something had happened. What it was is another matter. And there was this journalist called Clive Harold. There was 3 books written on the Welsh Triangle phenomenon, one of which was Peter Paget's The Welsh Triangle, so he was playing up the tabloid thing. There was Randall Jones Pugh wrote a book with Ted Holliday called The David Enigma. These were all paperbacks. The David Enigma was the last one to emerge, and that was very much sort of like into the mythology side and the what I would call the ultra-terrestrial theory. You know, the John Keel ideas about these things were coming from a parallel universe.
Right. Yeah.
And the third one was this, like the book called The Uninvited, and this was by this chap called Clive Harold, and if you read it as I did as a 10-year-old, it's not. It's creative non-fiction. He's basically written it like the Amityville horror.
Okay, right.
So it's and the thing that impresses me, and I think I sent you a scan of the inside. And there's a haunting picture. That's the one. I don't know whether you can expand that. Well, that shows Pauline Coombs standing at the window where this figure had stared through the window. And I remember looking at that and reading it, the story as a 10-year-old, and thinking, oh my God, you know, this is serious stuff. And I don't know whether you can read the caption underneath, but it says something about, Pauline Coombs with her daughters Leanne and Joanne at the window where she was observed by a giant glowing silver figure. The wall surrounding the window was badly scorched, and all efforts to repaint it have failed. Traces of radiation were later recorded in and around the immediate area. Now, I think this is where the exaggeration comes in, because who recorded the radiation? You know, that has never been mentioned anywhere else, and I don't think he actually talks about it in the book. But it's one of these things that's just sort of left hanging there. You know, if they'd really found radiation at that window, then then there was a biohazard, and the whole farmhouse and the neighbouring farmhouse would be evacuated.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, but Clive Harold is an interesting character because he later he'd gone to school with Prince Charles.
Wow.
He was a member of the aristocracy, and after writing that book, I don't know whether he was a gambler or something, but he lost his entire fortune, and he ended up homeless, selling the Big Issue on the streets of London. Because I came across, I searched on his name, and there was a whole story where he's interviewed as a Big Issue seller in the late 1990s, banging on about how he'd written this best-selling book, The Uninvited. And it was almost like a rags to riches story. So a fascinating collection of books. And Randall Jones Pugh as well, who was the Bufora investigator, he was a very religious man, and he was an evangelical Christian. And after he got heavily involved in investigating all these weird sightings of spacemen and UFOs, he became convinced that the whole thing was satanic, and that it was the devil. It was nothing to do with aliens. That it was these things had been sent by Satan to to sort of drag people into believing things that they shouldn't believe in if they were true Christians. So if you go to Haverfordwest and you look at the newspaper cuttings, there's a whole story about how he disposes of his entire library of UFO material and burns it because he thinks the whole subject's evil. And as he's throwing all these UFO books onto the bonfire, this evil face rises up out of the fire and confirms his belief that the whole subject is satanic. So it's an incredible story, Vinny. And we haven't even got onto the Spaceman.
Well, yeah, because that was, I stood out quite a bit in the program on Netflix. So did that come next after seeing this giant silver-suited man? I suppose it.
Well, this is where the Ministry of Defence involvement begins, because Randall Jones Pugh wrote to his local MP Nicholas Edwards, who was in Margaret Thatcher's government as well, Minister for Wales. This is later. basically saying, why isn't the Minister of Defence doing something about this? And the Minister of Defence did the usual thing and looked at their files and said, well, we've only had like 6 sightings from Wales.
Oh, right.
I think I said on the show that there'd been 450, but I think that was the MOD's record for the whole of the year, 1977.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But when they were responding to Nicholas Edwards, they were saying, "Well, we haven't had any odd, unusual sightings." But then what happened was Rosa Granville got involved. Now, Rosa Granville, whose daughter was interviewed on the show, she ran the Havenfort Hotel, and she was a woman from Spain who'd married a Welshman, and they'd set up this hotel right above this amazing beach. If you go to Broadhaven. I can't remember the name of the beach now. It's a surfing beach, and it's just amazing. And this hotel is on the hill above, and it had this reputation for being haunted, and also because she was Spanish, there was a bit of local hostility towards people from outside coming in and running businesses. I think she talks about that on the program, or her daughter does anyway. Anyway, one night, this is around the time that all this business was kicking off at Ripperston Farm, with the creature standing outside the window. She was woken up, and I think it was while her husband was away on business or something, with this light shining through the window. And I don't know whether there were any guests staying at the time, but she went to the window, looked out, and she saw what she described as like a half moon shaped object that had actually come down. She actually saw it land on the grounds outside the hotel, and she saw these 2 creatures emerge from it, dressed in like white boiler suits, who seemed to be sort of examining the area and sort of doing what UFO occupants did in the 1970s, sort of like what our astronauts did the Apollo missions when they landed on the moon, sort of picking up rocks and examining things and that kind of thing. And she, again, genuinely terrified by this. And she wrote to her local MP, Nicholas Edwards, and Nicholas Edwards duly passed it on to the Ministry of Defence. And rather than dismiss it this time, they actually contacted the local base, which was RAF Brawdy, because there was a number of quite sensitive military facilities in the area that the local journalist, Hugh Turnbull, thought might explain what was going on, because there was a secret US Navy facility that was a base for submarines that were monitoring Soviet nuclear testing that was quite close to the area. There was RAF Brawdy, where they had Hawker Hunters and pilots training there, and there was the Aberporth range where where the British Army and the Navy tested rockets. So you got all this within a 20-mile radius of where this outbreak of UFO sightings were. So they were obviously interested in what was going on, even though they wouldn't let on in publicly. And as a result of Rosa Granville's, or Granville, I don't know how you pronounce it, sighting, the head of the UFO desk, a guy called John Peduzzi at the time, he wrote to the community liaison officer at Brawdy, who appeared on the show. I'm trying to remember his name now, John Cowan.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been in correspondence with him some years ago, and he was actually sent to interview Rosa Granville. Now, that is something that they say they don't do.
Yeah.
But he did that, and he interviewed someone who'd had a close encounter of the third kind, and his account of his visit is in the files. I think you might have the document. So he reports back to the Ministry of Defence on what she said, and what was not mentioned in the program where Rosa Granville's daughter, they show her walking out, don't they, into the yard of the, and she was saying that this thing had left some traces or something in the grass, and she remembered seeing them. But Cowan, if you read his account there, he says there were no traces. He visited the site. But the interesting thing was, where this UFO landed and where these creatures were walking around is the site of a Royal Observer Corps underground bunker, which is not mentioned on the show. But that was exactly where she saw this thing. And that's what I think is really interesting, because, if this was something genuinely odd, interesting that it should be on the site where there was one of these bunkers, which were all around the country. You may have seen some yourself I mean, some of them are open to the public now. These were the things that the government built in the event of a nuclear war, where the Royal Observer Corps would be sort of underground monitoring radiation, and where some of the local council people would sort of go to coordinate what would happen in the aftermath of a nuclear war.
Yeah.
So I just think that's an interesting little
Mm,
detail. This is where she saw this UFO.
that's bizarre.
Mm. And both she, I mean, again, I think this showed some of this. Rosa Granville and Pauline Coombs, who was the lady at Ripperston Farm, they both claimed that they'd been visited by the Men in Black as well on the same day, within minutes of each other. This big sort of black hammer drive, and there's these two guys that looked identical, asking questions about what they'd seen, etc., etc., which was like something again very, very unusual that you don't tend to get now in UFO stories. But during the 1970s, this is the sort of weird stuff, almost out of the pages of a science fiction film, that was going on.
Yeah, strange, really strange. And I mean, I might be jumping too far forward. Didn't they have a joint sighting of a UFO at the same time as well? Is that another separate incident?
Yeah, that was later in the summer, I think. And this is what they used, quite a good reconstruction on the show. They actually showed where Ripperston Farm was and where the Haven Fort Hotel was. And then they're like both sides of a big sort of bay.
Probably show that on the
then
map,
you've got
actually.
this stacked rocks, which is like a rock formation which sticks out of the water.
So on the left here, so you've got...
That's it, where you point.
So is this the stacked rocks here?
Yes, that's stacked rocks. Yeah.
Which looks like that.
That looks like that, yeah. So what happened was, I can't remember which way around it was, whether it was Rosa who'd seen this. It saw like a classic sort of disc-shaped thing in the sky, reflected. This is in daylight, and she saw it descend, and almost like a doorway open in what she thought was a doorway open in the rocks, and this thing actually descend into the stacked rocks and disappear.
Wow.
And she phoned up, I think it was Pauline Coombs, to tell her, "Oh, go out, you can see this thing now." And Pauline Coombs was saying, "Yes, we're watching it," because they could see it from a different angle.
Yeah.
Weirdly, for some reason, when we were filming the Encounters thing, the team had found two other witnesses, I think they were firemen or something, who had come forward and said that they'd also seen this from another location in that sort of little area between the two equidistant points. And they'd actually gone out, and there were scuba divers, actually. They'd gone out the next day and scuba dived at the rocks and couldn't find any trace of anything. I don't know why they didn't use that interview in the program, because I was looking forward to hearing what they've got to say about it.
Yeah, that's like a follow-up extra bit of sort of data, at least, that someone actually went out and looked at it or tried to.
Yeah. So when Peter Paget, who wrote the Welsh Triangle, who was another sort of tabloid journalist who was sort of writing about this stuff at the time, and Clive Harold, they sort of documented these stories in this sort of tabloidese, the way that they wrote these two books. And their theory was that there was an alien base in the area, and it was beneath stacked rocks, and that's why this thing had descended and appeared to sort of disappear into the sea, effectively. And then you've got the link with the U.S. Navy submarine base, whether was there some connection there? Were they monitoring this underwater activity? And again, this all fits with what's going on at the present, isn't it? With the
very much.
With the thing about UFOs, the U.S. Congress now renaming them unidentified anomalous phenomena to include both things that are seen emerging from the sea or appearing in the sea. And there's always been stories like that. But then there is the alternative theory that Paul Devereux, when he wrote Earthlight's Revelation, he did a whole section on the Welsh Triangle, because he lived in that area, and he'd done he'd looked at the geology, and he was trying to relate some of the sightings to geological fault lines, that some of these things could be earthlights generated by proximity to faulting in West Wales. And the stacked rocks actually are right on a major sort of geological fault. So his theory was that, maybe they saw an earthlight and it was actually descending into the rocks when they saw it.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Many different explanations. And like I say, I tried to draw some links with the traditional stories and folklore of that area. Which, if you look at that material, it's uncannily similar. There's loads of stories about in Welsh folklore about people being misled by the fairies, being dragged into fairy rings and losing periods of time, seeing strange creatures that back in the day would be described as elves or goblins, but which in the space age we describe as spacemen. And I thought the guy Mark Marston, who was a cousin of the Pauline Coombs, who was describing the thing he'd seen on that country road, I thought was the most impressive story of all. I mean, I knew about his story. I'd seen it described in a newspaper cutting, but actually hearing him tell the story now, sort of how many 30, 40 years later, and I thought he was really, really impressive.
Yeah, that was a Spaceman sighting, wasn't it? Like a silver suit.
Yeah.
Really strange, tall as well, I think, again, wasn't it?
But he also saw an object as well, didn't he? I think, or a light or something, and in the trees. And then this figure just stepped out onto the road.
Strange.
Yeah.
But then, and I think there was a wave of sightings of these silver-suited beings or men around that time. But didn't someone say that they were walking past a charity shop and saw one of these boiler suits from the local oil refinery, and that sort of muddied the waters a bit?
Well, I'm glad you got onto that, because that takes us back to the guy from Brawdy, John Cowan, the community liaison officer. Because what happened was the guy at the UFO desk in London asked him to make discreet inquiries working with the Provost and Security Services. Now, this is an interesting link, because you'd be aware that there was all this story about the PS&S being the real sort of secret UFO investigators for the MOD. This is the RAF police as they've got this branch that investigates low-flying aircraft, and they had a remit during this period to investigate UFO sightings. And in the National Archives files, there's a thing saying, I am not telling the minister about this, but I think this is something we should make discreet inquiries about, involving the PS&S.
Wow.
Now, this is long before Nick Redfern wrote about the Provost and Security Services, and long before Tim Good knew about this. There is documented evidence that they investigated these spacemen sightings in West Wales. It's there in the documents that were released at the National Archives in 2008, I think it was. But unfortunately, their report isn't there. It's one of these missing documents that's so infuriating. But there is a later memo where the head of the UFO desk, John Peduzzi, writing to DI-55 later in the year, says, I asked the RAF police to look into this, and they discovered that there was a local prankster at work. So we think that's presumably what's in the missing report, that they did make these inquiries. And John Cowan remembers this, because he says when he went home and told his wife about the what Rosa Grenville had told him about these spacemen, and how she described them as really tall with a big black visor and a sort of a helmet. She said, "Oh, I've seen that spaceman as well." And he said, "Have you? Where?" And she said, "Oh, in a shop window in Haverfordwest." And Milford Haven, if you know that area of West Wales, has got a massive oil refinery. There's like loads of sort of industrial oil refining going on that's shipped out using the seaport at Fishguard. And they had, as all big refineries have, firefighting facilities in case the whole thing blows up and they have to send in teams.
Yeah.
And they had these silvery suits that look like astronaut costumes with a big inbuilt visor, obviously to protect their eyes from the flames. And apparently, at either before or after all this business kicked off with the spacemen peering through windows and things, two of these suits were on display in a haberdasher's window in Haverfordwest. And apparently there was a big sort of local Rotary Club party at which two jokers from the Rotary Club made these two suits disappear. They borrowed them, and they turned up at this party dressed as spacemen. Right. So that Cowan sort of put two and two together and thought, this has got to be connected with people seeing these spacemen. Right. But it wasn't until 1996 that this guy who was a member of the local Rotary Club, Glyn Edwards, he was called, came forward. And I don't know why the story got into the news again then. It must have been some kind of anniversary.
Right.
But there was an interview published in the Western Mail with Randall Jones Pugh, who was still alive then, and an interview with Glyn Edwards. And Glyn Edwards basically said, it's time for me to confess. I was the Spaceman. And he said, me and my mate borrowed these firefighting suits, and because we knew everyone was into UFOs and spacemen and this, that, and the other, we put these suits on and we went prowling around the local countryside. And there was one particular lady that we went to visit, who I think is Rosa Grenville, and obviously was. Oh no, it could have been Pauline Coombs. I'm not sure. But they went to an isolated farmhouse, which does actually sound like Ripperston Farm, and basically they had to do a runner because this woman emerged at the door holding what looked like a double-barreled shotgun. And I think I mentioned this in the show. This guy had to dive into to escape because he thought he was going to be shot. I mean, this is the thing with pranksters and farmers. It's not a good idea to go roaming around people's property when the farmers have got a right to shoot intruders. They do this with dogs, don't they?
Yeah.
So it's quite possible that what Billy and Pauline Coombs saw was Glyn Edwards. Now you might say, oh well, they were terrified. Well, of course they'd be terrified if someone dressed in a suit like that appeared outside your house, and particularly if you're living in the middle of nowhere, you would be bloody terrified, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But Ray Gosling, the BBC guy, he spoke to Glyn Edwards, and although there wasn't much on the programme he did about it, he was actually saying he did the prank in response to what was already going on, in that he'd already heard the stories, like Mark Marston's story about seeing spacemen. So he saw these suits on in the window and just thought, well, we'll create a few spacemen. So it doesn't sort of explain the whole flap. They obviously then went out pranking and created a few more spacemen sightings, but he was saying it wasn't something that they created themselves. They'd already heard that people were seeing these silver-suited creatures. So they were just doing a prank on the back of that.
Yeah.
Which makes it very difficult, doesn't it, to work out what's true, what's false, what's a memory of something. And this is why it's so difficult to get to the bottom of a lot of these UFO stories, particularly when you're looking at them 30 and 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I was born in 1977, so, we are talking a while ago.
Well, the Coombs family as well, who were the centre of all this, they have completely clammed up. They will not. All these different shows, and I know the BBC are trying to do a programme on the Welsh Triangle on the back of this show that we're talking about, and everyone's trying to speak to the Coombs, but they won't talk to anyone. They still live in the area.
Did they ever speak after that, or did they?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look in the newspaper cuttings that I mentioned, they're featured in lots of those. I think they were interviewed on TV at the time, but I think they've had such relentless ridicule, and over the years, they just think like a lot of people who get caught up in this subject, they're not in it for personal gain. They're not, they don't want the notoriety of it, so they just prefer to stay in the background.
Wow.
But they are like a classic sort of, like you see this in the paranormal, families who've moved into houses and they've been terrified by poltergeists and things. They had a similar thing, but they were being hounded by UFOs and creatures dressed as spacemen.
I mean, it almost sounds a bit like Skinwalker Ranch in America that experiences all that kind of, all sorts of strange stuff.
But putting my skeptical hat on, I did mention this earlier. A guy called Hilary Evans, who's been completely forgotten about now, but he was an amazing writer. He was a very erudite person who I really respected. He wrote a whole series of books on paranormal phenomena, and he ran a picture library which still exists called the Mary Evans Picture Library in London. he investigated, one of the first people to actually go out and investigate the Welsh triangles after all this publicity. And there was this amazing part work called The Unexplained that you may remember. Really, it was. I think it was reissued in the 80s or 90s. 19 parts, and they put some money into investigating all kinds of mysteries and UFO sightings. And anyway, Hilary Evans was basically sent from London, spent 2 weeks in Wales, and he talked to all the key people, and he basically debunked a lot of the nonsense that had been written in the tabloids and by Peter Paget and Clive Harold. He visited the Ripperston farm, and the thing that struck him when he went to Ripperston farm, having read all the amazing stories about them being pursued by aliens and, Billy Coombs' cattle teleporting, he couldn't believe his eyes that Ripperston farm was there, and adjoining it was another farm with a young couple living in it. I can't remember the names now, but he interviewed them, and they said, "Oh, they're always having strange things happen to them. We've never seen anything, and we live right next door." That their presence not mentioned in any of the previous articles. And when Hilary Evans asked them about the cows, they just said, "Well, he's always leaving gate open. Cows are always coming through into our yard, and that's just how he is."
Right.
So Hilary, wanting to believe, went out and spoke to some of these people and went to some of these places and was utterly confounded by what he found. And he also went, I was talking about the school, and you couldn't possibly see something come out of the sky and land there because of the geography of it.
Right.
There was all these thick trees, and he also found that there was this sewage farm behind it. And every now and again, obviously you get these big tractors pulling, trailers, loading and unloading things. And he spoke to somebody else who was working at the school, saying that they'd seen this silvery object when it was raining, maybe not the day the kids saw it, but they thought it was just one of these sewage lorries that was pulling some trailer, and that's what they'd seen. I don't personally think that explains the school sighting, but there was a lot of other stuff that Hilary found when he did the investigation on site that completely debunked some of the more sensational stories. And he also heard about the Glyn Edwards. He didn't know it was Glyn Edwards, but he'd picked up a lot of gossip from the street saying that, there was some guy who was in the local round table who was out dressed in this firefighting suit, terrifying people. But if you read his articles, and if you can get hold of a copy of The Unexplained, they're well worth reading. Hilary, and this is in the great traditions of skepticism, which I subscribe to, he debunks a lot of the nonsense, but then he says, whilst in Wales, I interviewed X number of people, and he talks about, gives some examples of people who'd seen things that I can't explain.
Right.
So he's not saying the whole thing was nonsense. He was like, this is my standpoint. Something was going on that we can't explain. But unfortunately, when you get things, when the kids go on TV and you get journalists involved and you get TV crews, it becomes more and more difficult to get to the bottom of it, because people start exaggerating. People start thinking, "Oh, I'll just add a bit to my story because I'm going to be on telly," that kind of thing. And to be fair on those kids, David Davies in particular, he's never changed his story. He sticks by the facts of what he saw, and as far as I can see, he hasn't actually changed his story at all in 40 odd years.
Yeah, I mean, it was very compelling to see them talk about it. Well, on the old interviews from when they were kids, but also, quite a few of them in 2023. So it's like you said, even though some things may have been debunked, there are still a lot that hasn't and probably won't ever be. But I think this is why we like these kind of things, because I think it shows historically that there's been strange phenomena happening everywhere. It's not a new thing. It's
And the sad thing was that after 1977, it just sort of faded. People lost interest in the Welsh Triangle in the way they'd lost interest in Warminster. There was the Havenfort Hotel tried to sort of set up like UFO sky watching weekends, and I think another hotel did as well, and they were moderately successful for a bit, but it just died a death. And then, of course, we got Rendlesham Forest came along soon after that.
Of course, 3 years later,
But 1977 was a big year for UFOs, because the UFOs were debated at the United Nations. Sir Eric Gairy, who was the president of Grenada at the time, he got the subject on the UN discussion list. I don't think it lasted long, and he was then deposed. There was a coup, weren't there? And later that year, 1977, Star Wars was released. Close Encounters of the Third Kind was 1978, I think it was. And again, making connections with what's going on in the present, I've just written a piece for 14 Times about this, which will be in the next issue of 14 Times. We've got the NASA study that's going on at the moment that's been kicked off. What's not been mentioned, and I found this bizarre, is the history of NASA's involvement or lack of involvement in the UFO subject. And a lot of people probably don't know this, but they almost triggered off a similar study in 1977 at the behest of President Jimmy Carter. It went virtually to the point of them appointing someone to be like, the head produce a report, do a study of all the evidential sightings that had occurred since the closure of Project Blue Book in 1968. And for whoever it was in NASA at the time, unlike the current director of NASA, just wouldn't have it.
Right.
Because Jimmy Carter, scientific advisor, wrote to, I think he wrote to Frank Press, who was either I think he was the NASA liaison officer with the Pentagon, and basically said, Jimmy Carter wants you to reopen the UFO files, basically, and NASA's the obvious place, the obvious agency to do this.
Yeah,
because we're being snowed under with correspondence from people who are saying they've seen things, and that the Condon Committee report is outdated, and we need to have another inquiry. And Jimmy Carter himself, it only came out in 1976, had his own UFO sighting. Now, as far as I'm aware, he's the only US president who's actually come out and said that.
Yeah, I think so.
So that was all in the same year, 1977. And I've just written a piece, as I say, for 14 Times that looks at the 1977 NASA UFO study that was killed off at birth, that never happened. But all the papers about it and all the correspondence about why they didn't think they should do the study then is really interesting in the context of what's going on now, because they basically said, well, what are we going to look at? All we've got are lots of stories from people. There's no hard evidence. We need something that we can bring to the NASA laboratories and put under the microscope. And they said they hadn't completely written off the idea, and if someone could bring something evidential, they would look at it. And what happened then is they had various people writing in saying, well, we've got some fragments of something that we think is from a UFO. Peter Sturrock, if you come across him, who was an American physicist who was interested in UFOs, actually took them on their word and said, well, I've got some, I think it was the magnesium from that case in Brazil from the 1950s, some object that disintegrated over a beach.
Was it?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And he said, well, what about this? You're saying you've got nothing to look at in the lab. We've got bits from the Ubatuba case. And NASA was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this?
Wow.
But they managed to get out of it, but it's come back to haunt them. And now they finally, how many years later, they finally decided to take a look at it.
It's crazy. Wow.
So that's the context, really, of what was going on in 1977. It was a huge year for UFOs, and it was my baptism into the subject as a 10-year-old, and I've never been able to get rid of it since. Here I am.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate you coming in discussing it. But I would still recommend to anybody watching or listening to go to Netflix, if it's still available whenever this is in the future that you're listening to it, and watch the Encounters series, definitely the Broadhaven Triangle, because it is really well done. And then either come back and listen to this again, or listen to this first, and put it into context. But yeah,
and if
thank you.
Track down the books; they're well worth a read.
I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, and Randall Jones Pugh's book is probably the most sane. The other two are just sort of, it's like reading, a tabloid version of what we've just been talking about.
Right.
But it's entertaining. It's entertaining. Yeah. And Hilary Evans' articles he wrote for the Unexplained. If you want an antidote to the mad part, then read Hilary Evans.
Right. Amazing. Well, David, thank you so much. As always, I really appreciate it. Anything else you've got coming up in the meantime?
only this piece for 14 times and just monitoring the current situation, which seems to change day by day.
Absolutely, it does
But
indeed.
I would say, just to finish off, if anyone fancies a UFO spotting holiday, I would highly recommend the West Wales coast. I'm not under sponsorship from Pembrokeshire National Park or anything, but you can visit some of these places. You know, that you can stay in the Haven Fort Hotel. I think they've actually got copies of the books on the Welsh Triangle in the hotel for your perusal.
Amazing.
The beaches are amazing if you pick the right weather to go to West Wales, and you've got a chance of getting clear skies as well and doing some sky watching.
Very true. There we go. Wonderful. Well, yeah, David, thank you so much to everyone as well. Anytime. Everyone watching, thank you as always for the support, and we will see you on the next one. Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.